Welcome to
America's Cannabis Conversation,
where you can hear experts from all facets of the cannabis business as to what's happening in this exploding industry. Keep yourself informed. Join the conversation. Welcome to America's Cannabis Conversation. Quick news. This is your host, Dan Perkins. Phoenix, Arizona. Subleasing likely to provide a path for out-of-state companies into Arizona's recreational cannabis market. With the January launch of Arizona's adult-use marijuana market, insiders predict strong growth in the number of out-of-state companies using the backdoor method to enter the burgeoning recreational industry, subleasing space in a large cultivation or manufacturing facility. The practice will allow out-of-state brands, and to a lesser extent, Arizona marijuana startups to tap into what is expected to be a large and rapidly growing market. In 2021, the Marijuana Business Factbook projects retail sales this year will reach between $250 million and $300 million and grow to $1.3 billion to $1.5 billion by 2025. Under Arizona's cannabis regulations, the 130 existing marijuana business license holders and the upcoming 26 social equity licenses can apply for recreational permits to run both cultivation and manufacturing facilities to supply their storefronts. Those cultivation and manufacturing centers don't have the same limits, meaning that each license holder can build them out as a large part of what they want and then sublease space to other companies wanting to grow cannabis, manufacture their own edibles lines, or produce other products. Steve White, CEO of Harvest, said the company has subleased space for some of its facilities to about 20 companies over the years. He said you're going to see people from other states look at different ways for them to enter a market, and your two choices are to find the ability to lease a license or spend $20 million to acquire your own. There are very few people who have the ability to say, I'll just pony up $20 million. Detroit, Michigan. A judge stops Detroit adult use cannabis licensing over a residency dispute. A federal judge has temporarily halted Detroit regulators from processing adult use cannabis license applications in response to a suit challenging the constitutionality of the city ordinance giving preference to longtime residents. A city official confirmed Detroit is temporarily halting the licensing process. The city, which started taking applications earlier this year, intends to issue as many as 75 retail licensing, 35 consumption lounge permits, and 35 micro-business licenses. At least 50% of the licenses must be issued to so-called Detroit legacy residents. U.S. District Court Judge Bernard Friedman issued a temporary restraining order that freezes the process, various Michigan media outlets reported, in response to a case filed by Crystal Love. Love wanted to apply for an adult use retail license, but doesn't meet the ordinance requirements even though she has lived in Detroit 11 of the past 30 years. Lowe's attorney has argued that the requirements violate equal protection provisions of the Michigan Constitution and the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Sacramento, California. California cannabis firm Glass House Group to be bought in a $567 million deal. California cannabis company Glass House Group is set to be acquired by a 2-year-old special acquisition company in a blockbuster $567 million deal aimed at creating California's largest vertically integrated marijuana business. According to a news release, Glass House Group will be listed on the Canadian NEO exchange under the ticker symbol GLAS.U after the deal closes, which is expected to be in the first half of this year. The transaction has a $1 billion equity evaluation. The deal also includes financing for the acquisition of 2 Glass House competitors, retailer Element 7 and cultivator Southern California Greenhouse. The new owners of Glass House Group will be the Toronto-based Mercer Park Brand Acquisition Corporation, an SPAC founded in 2019 with the goal of establishing a national marijuana brand. Denver, Colorado. UK's Tenacious Lab launches a buy and build CBD brand with a U.S. acquisition. A London-based buy and build global cannabinoid group launched this week after its acquisition of Denver-based CBD brands Press Pause and a brand focused on developing CBD products for women. Tenacious Labs, co-founded by CEO Nicholas Moreland and COO Adrian Clark, aspires to become a leading consumer-centric global cannabinoid group. Moreland said that the company's first acquisition of Press Pause is a major milestone in its strategy, providing it with an established direct-to-consumer brand in the United States. Terms of the cash and stock acquisition were not disclosed. Press Pause co-founder Don Stable joins Tenacious Labs as head of Pause Life Brands to drive international growth and create products in line with the brand's mission to promote the importance of self-care. That's your American Cannabis Conversation Quick News. I'm Dan Perkins. Now let's see who's joining the conversation today. First up is Ryan Douglas, author of From Seeds to Success on How to Launch a Great Cannabis Cultivation Business in Record Time. Next up is Mike Regan, who's going to talk about investing in cannabis equity and what's happening in the markets because of what's going on in Washington. Our third guest is Morgan Fox, who is the Media Relations Director for the National Cannabis Industry Association and is our legislative expert talking about all the things that are going on not only in Washington, D.C., but around the country. And last but not least is Dr. Michael Lewis, who founded Brain Health Education and Research Institute to pursue educational and research endeavors, furthering the knowledge of natural and nutritional ways. He's going to talk to us about what's happening in COVID-19. So let's join the conversation.
Welcome to the New Product Buzz segment on The Conversation. We'll be keeping you updated on new cannabis and CBD products in the marketplace. We will talk to the playmakers and entrepreneurs who are driving the expansion of this incredible industry.
Welcome back to The Conversation, and joining us today is Ryan Douglas, who's the author of a book called From Seeds to Success, or How to Launch and Grow Cannabis Cultivation Business in a Record Time. I'm fascinated by the title. And by the way, Ryan, thank you for joining us today.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
I've looked at this, and as I've interviewed people on this program, what I hear when I talk to people about where to invest their money, what keeps coming up all the time is growers as opposed to dispensaries. And I find that fascinating. I had a gentleman on our show, a regular, and he's in the business of buying dispensaries, mom and pops. And he said to build an Apple-type dispensary, you got to spend between $500,000 to $750,000, maybe if you really want to go hog wild, up to $1 million. And there was recently, late last fall, a state-only company that had 5 dispensaries, which they spent on average of $750,000 each to build out. They sold them in a syndication deal for $350,000 a piece. And what he's saying is that the business model has already changed, and that as the consumer has become more sophisticated, they're more interested in the product and what the products, how they're different and how they can help them, as opposed to going to a dispensary to figure out what they want to buy. So when I heard about your book, I was fascinated because cultivation is obviously the source of supply. We know that there are certain states around the country who've opened up with an insufficient amount of cultivation. So what was the genesis for writing your book?
So this was based on my experience consulting with startup groups over the last 4 years. And what I found is that when potential clients called me to come have a look at their production site to address a certain problem that they're having, it was very seldom a technical issue like the wrong kind of fertilizer or the wrong kind of grow light. Almost 9 out of 10 times it came down to very basic business principles that weren't addressed prior to even planting any seeds at all. So anyone that's familiar with cannabis growing at all knows that there's dozens of printed grow books and a plethora of growing information and websites online if you want to know how to grow cannabis. What I found that there was absolutely nothing of was a business book that could speak to people from any industry and really lay down a clear path for planning and launching commercial cannabis cultivation business. And so that's what I set out to do with this book, was basically provide a step-by-step method for researching, planning, raising funds, designing, launching, and expanding a successful commercial cultivation business with the goal of coming to market as quickly as possible.
Do you prefer in your book growing inside or outside?
So I'm preferable to outdoor growing, and by outdoor I mean greenhouse growing. So for a couple of reasons. One is it's my background and my training is in traditional horticulture. So even prior to touching cannabis on a commercial scale, I was growing ornamental crops and edible crops in commercial greenhouses across the U.S. So that's really where I'm coming from. That's my training. That's what I know best. But as we look ahead into the future, cultivation businesses need to anticipate that they'll come under increasing pressure to minimize their carbon footprint. So for any listeners that aren't familiar with how cannabis is grown indoors, they use a lot of grow lights, which generate a lot of heat, and they require industrial strength dehumidifiers in HVAC units in order to evacuate that heat. So not only do the lights consume a lot of electricity, but the equipment to dehumidify the area and cool the area requires a lot of electricity as well. And it's simply not a very green method of cultivating plants. And if we look to every other commercially produced crop in the world, we as cannabis growers, we're the only ones that do it completely indoors. So it's simply, it's not the most efficient way to grow, and it's certainly not the most environmentally friendly way to grow. So I much prefer to grow in greenhouses because from my perspective, it makes a lot more sense.
So just so our audience understands, define for them and for me what you mean by greenhouses.
Sure. So it's a controlled environment. Typically, it's a structure made out of glass or plastic, and the most basic structures simply protect the crop from rain or inclement weather. On the other end of the spectrum, the most sophisticated high-tech greenhouses can control lighting, temperature, humidity, airflow, carbon dioxide, everything. So there's a wide range of technology, and depending on the crop that someone's growing or the region of the world they're in, there's different recommendations for different situations.
Are greenhouses going to have to get, if they're going to do that, have to get much, much larger? And does the indoor growing that you just talked about with the lights and the air conditioning and everything else, are those going to become less and less viable?
So what is a large greenhouse is relative. If you look at a crop like hydroponic tomatoes, this is a very popular product. You can find it in every single grocery store in the country. But every year you've got companies that are building massive high-tech greenhouse facilities to service that market. So, what is big? Is 4 acres big or is 40 acres big? It's really all relative, but generally speaking, I see the industry moving in that direction. So I think we'll see less and less indoor grow operations and more greenhouse operations. So when you look at places like California, when you go into an adult use dispensary in California, they've got dozens of varieties sitting behind a glass counter case. And so visual appeal actually plays a lot into the consumer's purchasing decision. And so in those instances, if you've got an adult use market and you're commanding premium prices for the product, then actually indoor growing can be justified in that scenario. But if you're growing to produce oil for vape pens or for creams or tinctures or food, the consumer never really sees the flower. All they see is the end product that they purchase. So greenhouses really come in handy for high volume, low cost production for anything that isn't pure flower sales in a dispensary.
So if we look at that, the idea that we're going to grow these various products, I want to take you back to your master grower title. Do you see any new strains coming on board in cannabis that are going to be dramatically changing the desire of the consumers?
If we look at the adult use market, which is really the fastest growing segment and the most lucrative for entrepreneurs, what consumers are looking for are two things. They're looking for a flower that offers high THC and a unique mix of terpenes. So those terpenes are what really gives cannabis its distinct aroma and taste when it's consumed. And then the THC, of course, is directly related to the high, the feeling that someone gets. So it's kind of the same thing when you go out looking for maybe a craft beer. You look for something maybe that has a good alcohol content and a really unique flavor. And so when we look ahead to what will be the most popular varieties in the future, rather than kind of concentrate on specific names, what we want to look for is high THC and a unique mix of terpenes with a smell or a taste that is rare or no one's growing yet. That's what people are going to gravitate towards.
Tell the audience where they can get your book and how they can follow you.
Absolutely. So folks can reach me through my website at douglascultivation.com. And there you can sign up for a monthly newsletter or follow my social media or purchase the book.
Well, thank you for joining us today. It was a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
If you missed any of this terrific interview on growing cannabis, please go to W420radionetwork.com. We'll be right back.
It's time for you to make a decision about your health care. It's time for you to make a decision on how you're going to protect yourself against viruses. Isn't it time to make sure you have the strongest immune system you possibly can? Isn't it time to make a decision to buy CV Sciences CV Acute and CV Defense to help you build the strongest antiviral immune system you can? It's time for you to go to empoweryourself.info and purchase CV Acute and CV Defense and take charge of your health care.
Welcome to the New Product Buzz segment on The Conversation. We'll be keeping you updated on new cannabis and CBD products in the marketplace. We will talk to the playmakers and entrepreneurs who are driving the expansion of this incredible industry. Thinking about starting up a cannabis business? Next up on The Conversation is our cannabis serial entrepreneur.
Welcome back to The Conversation. And joining us today is Mike Regan, our money guy. And we're going to talk about investing in cannabis equity. We've been talking about the general market's doing well. Cannabis hasn't done quite as well as the broader market indexes. So we're asking Mike today to tell us, if I haven't had cannabis in my portfolio, where should I be buying? Mike, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dan. So good to be here.
So what say you?
Well, in general, if you can boil it down to one sentence, I would say the U.S. operators are more attractive than the Canadian operators at this point. And one thing I see a lot of times with, with investors who may be new to cannabis is they sort of lump the entire publicly traded sector into one. But what you have to understand is the Canadian market. Well, first, cannabis in general is sub-markets. Colorado is not California, is not Canada. So you have to, at least at the very high level, split between the Canadian operators and the U.S. operators. So within that, the fundamental investment stories, like with any other business, are generally different. The U.S. operators, at this point, basically offer a larger market that's growing faster, with higher margins at a lower valuation, to really boil it down. Within that, though, of course, you always have to then apply sort of standard things you would for any investment in terms of looking at, the quality of the management team, how well they've executed in the past, the quality of the balance sheet, and just the quality of the general strategy. In contrast, the Canadian market is basically, at this point, still oversupplied and still seeing price pressure, which in any business, price pressure usually pressures margins. So sales can go up, but it's still harder and harder to make money as you sell more and more for less and less, essentially. And it's very difficult to sort of match that, get down the cost curve to keep making a profit on the lower sales. That's basically what the Canadian market has been dealing with. But because it's federally legal there, institutional investors can legally invest in that market, so that market typically has higher valuations. By my math, the Canadian companies are trading at closer to 6 times sales, whereas the Americans are more like 3.5 times sales. And then in terms of just the profitability, very few Canadian operators are even making EBITDA at this point, so that multiple doesn't even make sense. Whereas the U.S. companies are trading at, these are sort of the larger, well-executing ones, or at least ones that have estimates. They're trading about 12, 13 times 2021 estimated EBITDA.
So when you look at what you're saying, aren't there Canadian companies that own U.S. operations?
So when I say Canadian, this is where they're operating. In terms of the actual stocks, if you have what I'm treating as an American company that has operations in America but trades in Canada, that's in my mind American. So when I talk about the American ones, I'm talking about Curaleaf, Columbia Care, Cresco, Harvest, Trulieve, Planet 13, Forefront. They all have stocks that trade in Canada, but they're American operations, right? Like Trulieve is all in Florida and is expanding to Pennsylvania now, as a contrast to Aphria, which is in Canada, and Aurora, Canopy, Cronos. Those are all exclusively in Canada. Those companies, to maintain their legality, cannot operate in the U.S. where it's federally illegal.
So when you think about what's going to happen here, if I understood you correctly, you're saying that one of the problems in Canada is oversupply.
Yes.
So there's too much product.
Yeah, basically the companies there in raising capital were incented to raise more capital and have larger operations. And then as a result, there's just too much production versus market demand. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same as oil or coffee or soybeans. If there's more of something than the market demands, then the price goes down. And if there's a shortage, the price goes up. The Canadians have been cutting the capacity back. Like if you look at David Klein, when he's joined Canopy, he started to shut down some of the production operations they had and shift to lower cost outdoor from higher cost indoor. But the market's still seeing price pressure. Even after your report last week, they still had prices down, I think about 5 or 6% overall. The Canadian government has the prices down, and that's sort of another issue, is that they're still more expensive than the illicit channel, or the unlicensed channel as they call it in Canada, where at the end of the day, if the customer can get a good product at a lower price, they usually move that way. That's good for the sales. I mean, the sales are up, and Canada's now for the first time, according to their estimates, more licensed than unlicensed. But as an investor, it can be difficult if you're just not making money, where you have to cut costs to make it profitable. Well, just in the U.S., you have the operators these operators at least are typically profitable, at least on an EBITDA basis. And you have additional catalysts of incremental legalization, new states legalizing, new states going from medical only to rec only, and the potential to have some burdens on their financing removed. If you can pass the Safe Banking Act, that would basically give the operators access to normal banking and cheaper loans. And if you could ever remove the 280E taxes, that would remove a big tax expense that they currently have that other operators don't have. So those good positives are ahead of them, if that makes sense.
Sure. I know that Biden and Harris have indicated they want to decriminalize marijuana. And if he wins, do you think that that's a likely scenario?
I think a Biden administration is generally more favorable to cannabis than the current Trump administration. It would especially come down to changing the Senate, which is still controlled by Mitch McConnell. So that would be the real hang-up on, for example, the Safe Banking Act. That passed the House actually, but it couldn't pass the Senate. So right. I think it depends as much on how the overall government changes in the election versus just the presidency, but it is generally thought of as more favorable. I think Senator Harris mentioned decriminalization, which is good to talk about incremental legalization. Although you can get into the nuances, and we don't exactly know what that looks like of decriminalization versus legalization. But in general, it's a positive.
So your bias would be towards investing in the United States as opposed to Canada. Is that correct?
Essentially, yeah. You can't view just cannabis companies as like exposure as you can with some other sectors, just because the markets are so fundamentally different. Because basically, if the U.S. legalizes, that's a much larger positive benefit to the companies operating in the U.S. already that currently can't get normal loans or normal mortgages and normal banking, and currently have to pay huge taxes under 280E. If that goes away, that's a huge benefit. Whereas for the Canadians, if the U.S. legalizes, then they have a new market to enter, which is great. Don't get me wrong. It helps them too. But they're basically now an entrant into a new competitive market.
So do you have things that you're telling your clients about as far as what are the opportunities to invest in the U.S.? And before you go there, just let me ask you a question. What do you think is a good percentage of an American portfolio should be invested in cannabis investments? And then what ones do you like?
In terms of that first question, that's going to be different for everybody. So I can't really answer that. I generally think, this is, if you're doing sort of bottoms-up research on what are growing companies, and you look at just growing sectors in general, this is a rapidly growing sector that has a lot of positive catalysts behind it that I think will be a rapidly growing sector for a long time. So it's not sort of like a cyclical blip and then it drops off. And in the meantime, it's got, it has those catalysts, but part of those catalysts are it going from illegal to legal. That's the thing you always have to remember, that this is sort of not your standard industry and standard growth story, but that's what makes the opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. So within that, it's always easier to look at the, with sort of a good background trend, you then want to look for the ones that have, the better management teams that have proven they can execute and better balance sheets, right? A lot of the, when I referenced some of the valuations, before, a lot of the companies that did not have that aren't even on that, right? Because they're basically being restructured. There were a lot of cannabis companies that were not managed well and had terrible balance sheets where, the equity's been basically wiped out. So you always want, but that's true of any sector. You always want the better management teams and the better balance sheets. So in terms within that, the ones I generally like from a fundamental management perspective that seem to be better run, that have better balance sheets, are typically Columbia Care and Cresco and Curaleaf. Those are typically the rare ones, and Trulieve has been done extremely well in Florida, and we'll see how long they can keep that up. But that's been pretty well managed in terms of having roughly 50% share of the medical market in Florida.
There are 11 states right now that have recreational, and 33 states that offer medical. They're talking about 5 states possibly being added in November for recreational. So it would appear that not only recreational, when it gets into a state that has medical, seems to explode in sales. With only 11 states having recreational, just if you converted the other 33 states to recreational, it would appear that you could have tremendous growth.
Overall, generally, you had mentioned previously that the illicit market's thought to be, if you throw out $68 billion, that seems order of magnitude correct. One knows exactly, but to the extent the current cannabis business is only, about 17, and then if you all of a sudden, if you flip the switch and made the entire country legal tomorrow, a $17 billion market can become a $60, $70 billion market overnight.
We've been speaking to Mike Regan, who's our money guy, and he's been talking about things to buy in the cannabis space if you want to add it to your portfolio. Mike, how do people follow you?
You can read everything that I write about on my website, mjresearchco.com or mjresearchco.com.
Well, thank you. We've been speaking today with Mike Regan, and if you missed any of this interview, you can go to w420radionetwork.com. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll be right back. Hello, this is Dan Perkins from America's Cannabis Conversation, and I'm here to talk to you about CV Sciences, the company that developed the immune system support products called CV Acute and CV Defense. One of the questions I asked the company was, how safe and effective are these products? Recently, I interviewed Stuart Tonk on my show, and here is his response to my question.
Science supports it. CV Acute and CV Defense are backed by research cited by the World Health Organization for immune system challenges. It's safely used in hospitals. That's right, CV Acute is safely used in hospitals in Europe and in China.
If you want a productive immune system, you need to purchase both CV Defense and CV Acute. You can find out more information about both of these products at empoweryourself.info. Empower yourself and take charge of your response to COVID-19. You have the power to control yours and your family's health care.
It's time for the Cannabis and CBD Legislative Update. Things are changing in Washington, D.C. and all around the country about cannabis and CBD. The Conversation's Legislative Update will keep you informed on the rapidly changing cannabis and CBD industry legislation.
Welcome back to the conversation, and we're talking about a legislative update. We have with us Morgan Fox from the National Cannabis Industry Association, who works in Washington and has been on our show many, many times. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thanks for having me again.
You're welcome. So there's a lot of things going on at the state level, the state legislatures, governors threatening vetoes. Others are trying to get it done in record time. States that looked like they were going to take a long time are now rapidly moving towards adult use. And Schumer said recently in Washington that he hoped to have something in this session on a lot of stuff as far as cannabis. So give us the lay of the land, both at the federal level and what's going on in the states, if you would, please.
Absolutely. Just starting at the state level, last week we saw something that has never happened in the decade plus that I've been working on this issue, is that two state legislatures approved adult use cannabis bills in the same week, really within 48 hours of each other, in New York and New Mexico. The governor of New York has already signed that bill, and it looks like implementation is moving forward fairly rapidly. And that was actually a pretty groundbreaking bill in that it is incredibly robust in terms of the restorative justice provisions and the amount of cannabis tax revenue that's going towards community reinvestment and supporting social equity applicants and licensees. New Mexico has been working on this issue for a while as well, and a similarly really positive bill passed there and is just awaiting signature from the governor there. And that basically means that so far in the first 3 months of 2021, we've seen 3 state legislatures pass legalization, and that is really unheard of, and I think is really indicative of the momentum and accelerated pace of reform that we're starting to see that was really kicked off with the the passage of the Safe Banking Act, and then compounded by the ballot initiative victories in November of last year, and then further compounded at the federal level by House passage of the MORE Act, which would remove cannabis from the Schedule of Controlled Substances and provide a regulatory framework, as well as expunging the records of people who have been charged with federal cannabis-related crimes, and a number of other provisions that I think are going to help inform the conversation in Congress going forward. So moving into federal landscape, we've seen a number of bills introduced already. Both the House and the Senate have reintroduced the Safe Banking Act, which would provide safe harbor to financial institutions to be able to more easily work with cannabis businesses and open up things like traditional lending, which is incredibly important for small businesses that don't have access to deep financial networks. We saw the reintroduction of the Claims Act, which would basically provide the same sort of coverage, but for insurance companies as opposed to banks and other financial institutions. And then a number of other bills are in the works. I believe that the Marijuana Data Collection Act is going to be reintroduced fairly shortly, and we are awaiting reintroduction of the MORE Act with probably a few changes from the version that was passed by the House last year, in particular stripping out a provision that was added at the last minute before the vote that would allow federal regulators to ban people with felonies from being able to get federal cannabis business licenses, which kind of defeats the social justice intent of that bill. But I think that most of the attention has been on Senate Majority Leader Schumer, who, along with Senator Wyden and Senator Booker, have been prioritizing cannabis policy reform in their work this year and are expected to deliver draft legislation for a comprehensive bill similar to the MORE Act in that it deschedules cannabis and removes it from the Controlled Substances Act, but with probably some differences in terms of what the regulatory structure looks like and the sort of justice provisions that are contained within it. We still haven't seen that legislation yet, but we're expecting it any day, and Senator Schumer's team has been very proactive in engaging with stakeholders like NCIA and other groups to help inform their drafting of the legislation. So we're pretty hopeful that this is going to be a really good-looking bill and that it could potentially have far-reaching bipartisan support. Whether or not it could pass this year, I think, is a little bit tougher to tell and a little bit less likely than some of the more incremental measures, given that Republicans still have a fair amount of swing in the Senate, and the fact that traditionally they've been a little bit more in favor of incremental measures than more comprehensive measures. But that's starting to change as GOP lawmakers at both the state and federal level are starting to see that approval is shifting among their base.
I believe that I read recently there may be upwards to 50,000 people physically incarcerated on drug charges that under legislation would no longer be a crime. And my question to you is, if you have an answer or if not, an opinion, are we going to let 50,000 people out of jail, out of prison, if this thing passes and they're coming out back into our society, or what's the likely outcome?
Well, so I'm not sure about that number, and I think that it's pretty difficult to be able to determine that because the state-level prison system has a lot of different reporting methods than the federal system and the Bureau of Prisons. So, I think that number could be high, it could be low. But in terms of federal legislation, the MORE Act, as well as, and we're assuming the Senate bill, are going to include provisions that allow for expungement, commutations, and pardons for people that have nonviolent cannabis-related charges or convictions. But the problem is that at the federal level, that's a very, very small number because the vast majority of cannabis arrests take place at the state level. So while it's definitely a move in the right direction, this isn't going to have nearly as much impact as it will when states start picking this up. And they increasingly have done so. I mean, Illinois has been issuing blanket expungement for people with cannabis charges and have expunged hundreds of thousands of records so far. There's, a number of states are really pushing forward with this pretty heavily, and I think that federal legislation that includes expungement will provide a good message for states to start pursuing the same. And it's entirely possible that whatever legislation eventually gets passed may even provide funding for state programs to be able to expunge people's records faster. Expungement is usually a little bit more I guess, politically palatable to conservatives than things like commutations and early release and things like that. But I think that activists are going to be pushing for as much retroactive justice as they can possibly get, because it absolutely does not make any sense for anybody to be in prison for behavior that is now legal. And not only that, but even if you're not imprisoned, the effects of having a cannabis arrest on your record can have terrible collateral consequences for the rest of your life and impact your ability to get education, housing, employment, and a whole host of other things that most people take for granted.
So that we have two issues here. There are fewer number of federal Bureau prisoners who are there for low-level controlled substance issue. This is more of a state issue. And I totally agree with you. I have seen many states that are looking to make the product legal have tied in expungement or release as part of the criteria for getting it. Do you think there's a groundswell of support for doing both expungement and release?
Absolutely. And, because most people that with cannabis arrests are not in prison, there's much more of an emphasis on expungement and clearing out records. But there is a growing and really powerful movement now to get people released who are currently incarcerated for nonviolent cannabis crimes.
And you think that would be, and that's on a federal level or state or both?
Actually, it's happening at both levels. Groups like the Last Prisoner Project are really bringing a lot of attention to the issue and, finding individual cases where people are serving very lengthy sentences for relatively low level and completely nonviolent violations. So, hopefully we start to see even more as it's indefensible to be, making this behavior legal while continuing to punish for years and even decades people who are doing things now or who are doing things that now are like legal and done by publicly traded companies.
Yeah, there are some people who are starting to see conversations about the idea of changing the legal status of cannabis. Is that, and we've had some brief conversations on this in the past, but I'm seeing more that the makeup of the industry will change dramatically with legalization because the mom and pops are going to have a diminished role. The big multi-state, multi-operators, multinational companies are going to come in and take control of the market.
Well, as I mentioned on your show before, I really see the cannabis industry shaping up very much like the beer industry, where you have some large companies that control a significant market share, but then you also have a robust craft industry that also controls a significant market share. You're starting to see that already play out. And the fact that more and more, and now basically anytime you talk about cannabis legalization in any state, you have to talk about social equity and increasing fairness in the industry. And most of these conversations are also revolving around making sure that small businesses have a means to compete and lowering the barriers to entry. So I think that as long as advocates are continuously working on these issues, I don't think that mom and pops have too much to fear. But it's absolutely vital that they stay involved in the political process and work with advocates to make sure that their interests are protected at both the state and federal level. And I'm very hopeful that that will continue to be the case because just last week, I believe Senator Schumer stated in an interview that he was going to be crafting the legislation specifically to make sure that gigantic companies don't completely dominate the industry, and that the little guy has an ability to maintain a market share.
Well, unfortunately, Morgan, we're out of time. It always seems to fly when we have you on the show. We've been speaking to Morgan Fox, who is the legislative assistant and liaison for the National Cannabis Industry Association in Washington, D.C. So how can people keep current with what's going on with your organization and your positions on this decriminalization?
Well, you can just go to our website at thecannabisindustry.org, sign up for our newsletter, and we're also available on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram.
Thank you again for joining us today.
Hello and welcome. This is the next installment of What's in the Bottle, sponsored by CV Sciences. We think it's important for you to know what's in the bottle, and so this week we're going to talk about zinc. Zinc is needed for proper growth and maintenance of the human body. It is found in several systems and biological reactions. It is needed for immune function, wound healing, blood clotting, thyroid function, and much more. Meats, seafood, dairy products, nuts, beans, and whole grains offer relatively high levels of zinc. Zinc deficiency is not uncommon worldwide, but it is rare in U.S. Symptoms include slow growth, low insulin levels, loss of appetite, irritability, hair loss, rough and dry skin, and many, many more. Zinc might also have effects against viruses. It appears to lessen the symptoms of the rhinovirus common cold, but researchers yet can't explain why it works. If you want to help support your immune system to fight off viruses, then zinc is one of the important elements you need, and that's why it's in CV Defense. To learn more about a strong immune system, go to empoweryourself.info. This is Dan Perkins. Welcome back to the conversation. And joining us again is Dr. Michael Lewis. He's going to talk to us, and we're going to have a discussion about just tell me what the hell to do. Dr. Mike, welcome back to the program.
Great to be back, Dan.
Tell me what the hell to do, because I think that America has reached the point where enough about masks and sanitizing your hands. That doesn't do anything. It may clean up the outside of my body, but it sure as heck doesn't do anything else I need to do inside. And nobody seems to be talking about what to do inside. In fact, everything is focused on the vaccine. And what happens if it doesn't work? Or what happens if we don't get enough people to take it to create a herd immunity? I agree with you, Doctor, and I've been saying people are just looking for somebody to tell them in a logical way what I should do and why I should do it. So, Doctor, here's the question. What should we be doing, and how do we do it?
Well, there's two big areas. Number one is psychologically, what should we be doing or to help with our psychological health? But more importantly, I think, is what do we do for our physical health? So let me just say something about the psychological side of things. And certainly, you know, we've gotten conflicting messages. Do we wear masks? Do we not wear masks? Do you do this? Do you not? And I think that's been a massive failure on the part of our leadership, particularly at the CDC, where they've not taken there's not been a coherent message, and that's unfortunate. So psychologically, what can we do? Number one, I'm looking at what are the longer term effects. What are going to be the emotional side effects that our children are going to have for the rest of their lives, because they're growing up in this environment where they can't go to school and everything's hidden by a mask, and we're just bombarded by news. So number one, in my opinion, is turn off the news. We talk about limiting screen time. We've talked about this since we were kids, and television. Get out, go outside and play. Stop watching so much television. Well, we need to limit screen time for adults too, because there's not 24 hours of news out there. There's a half hour of news, and there's 23 and a half hours of opinion about the news on 6,000 channels. And if that's not enough, you're getting it from social media and your friends. So limit your news. Stay informed. You got to put the electronics down and get outside, which is sort of the number two, is get outside, get fresh air, get exercise, get some vitamin D from the sunshine, but get outside. Get your kids outside playing without masks. Get them playing in the dirt. So the second and third thing would be diet and exercise. Take this opportunity if you're telecommuting to work or whatever your work situation is, take a break and get outside, go exercise, lose that 10 or 20 pounds that you've always said you've been wanting to lose, and make kitchen time, family time, when you can exercise with your family and loved ones, and you can spend time in the kitchen and eat healthy. And so that gets us into sort of what can we do on the internal side of things. And I'm a big fan of not just eating healthy, but what do you eat? But what do you not eat? And the not eat side of things is sugar and simple carbohydrates, without a doubt. We need to cut back on the amount of sugar we intake and all the artificial flavorings and colorings and sweeteners. All those things, and particularly sugar, really hurt our immune system. And that added stress from all that exposure, that's causing so much stress, and that hurts our immune system, so that we're stressing out about the thing that we need our immune system to be strong for. And then I'm a huge fan of targeted nutritional supplementation. I think I've got sort of a cocktail of 5 things that I think that work really, really well. I use them on a daily basis. I have my friends and family use it on a daily basis, and I've had friends and family who have gotten very sick with COVID-19, and I triple or quadruple up this regimen, and it helps them. It's helped everybody that I've had to deal with recover or have a very mild form of this disease.
Well, it's interesting, Doctor. Listening to what you were saying, I look at what have I changed in my life over the last 10 months. I've lost about 40 pounds because I walk about 4.5 miles a day. I listen to books on tape when I'm walking. I take a good supply of the basic elements, including CV defense, and I think I'm healthy. But, Doctor, I live on this little island, and we just got the number yesterday where we are in terms of cases, and we're up from the beginning of December. I know this is almost the end of December. We're up 30% in cases in 4 weeks. We're a very high winter tourist seasonal place, and we hit peak season about February the 1st, and I'm terrified of what's going to happen to the caseload, because when you're on an island, you're surrounded by water. But now I'm on an island surrounded by water, surrounded by the coronavirus, and nobody's telling us what we should be doing. The only information we get from our local government is how many positive cases there are. Get nothing else. And it's becoming more and more concerning because you feel like the walls are coming in on you. And so it's important what you're talking about, and that is making sure that you feed the system that's your greatest defense against this, the immune system. And I don't think, Doctor, and you may disagree with me, I don't think there's been a lot of talk in the mainstream media about the importance of the immune system. It's focused all on the vaccine. And if I'm correct, Doctor, and you're the doctor, but if I understand what I've heard correctly, the vaccine is really designed to help strengthen the immune system to fight the virus, to keep it from spreading within your body. Is that a fair description?
Well, that's a basic, fair description. It's all about prompting the immune system to have a response, what we call the antibodies. And there's basically 2 ways to get antibodies. One is you get the disease itself, and the other one is through a vaccine that stimulates your immune system to develop the antibodies, so that when you're exposed to the disease, that antibody response is sufficient enough to keep you either from getting the disease or letting it get a hold of you, or keeping it so mild that it's not really an issue. We don't know you from getting the disease and spreading it to the next person. There's lots of things we don't know yet about this disease. So the vaccine is going to be helpful, but ultimately you got to keep your immune system strong and healthy.
Doctor, you're an MD. You've been in a practice for a long time, and you just mentioned some of your friends and family how you've taken over some of their care and nutritional. What would you say to our listeners of what they should be doing? I know you've already talked about exercise and diet, but what other things can they do to strengthen and balance their immune system so that they have an effective weapon to fight against the virus while they're waiting on the vaccine?
Well, I think the most important thing besides cutting out the sugars and eating healthy is what kind of supplements that you can take. And so I've got a list of some 5 basic supplements that I think are really, really important. And the first one would be vitamin D. I mean, we heard, Anthony Fauci talked about, well, he takes vitamin D and vitamin C on a daily basis. And when President Trump was discharged from Walter Reed, they discharged him on vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc. So vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc are, number 1, 2, and 3. Absolutely. So those are probably the 3 most important. And then there's 2 other ones that I'd like to throw in there. One is fish oil or omega-3s, because one of the issues with coronavirus is it causes our blood to clot too easily, and that's one of the things that can put you into the ICU or even cause death. Well, a good dose of fish oil helps keep your blood from clotting too easily. Plus, it's antioxidant and lots of other good benefits from that. And the other one is something called quercetin, Quercetin. And quercetin is basically these polyphenols that are found sort of the good stuff in the skin of an apple, as an example. So we'll get back to that apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, here's the scientific reason why. And quercetin's available as a supplement over the counter. And it helps, and it works in conjunction with zinc, and it works with the omega-3s to help support our body's immune system in so many different ways. It actually even has some anti-cancer effects as well. So those 5 things, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, fish oil, and quercetin are absolutely my top 5. And then CV Sciences has come out with a new product called CV Defense, C as in Charlie, V as in Victor, which is really meant for daily immune support. And it's got a number of those things in there. It has vitamin D and it has zinc, but it also has vitamin A, selenium, and something called PEA. It's a long chemical name, but PEA is this great substance that our body makes and helps support our immune system on a daily basis.
I can just see the shelf in my bathroom full of all those bottles. But if I took the CV Defense, you said many of the things that are on your list. I'm trying to be overly simplified here, doctor, but if I could just take 1 pill a day or 2, whatever the requirement is, makes my life simpler, and it's something I can execute on a timely basis. What would you say about using the CV Defense?
I would use CV Defense and fish oil would be my combo. And if you start to get sick, then you really up the amount of CV Defense to, instead of once a day, you would use it, 3 or 4 times a day to really up those amounts. But you could then add the other things in there like we talked about. And they also, CV Sciences has also come out with a CV Acute. So it's really meant for a 2 to 3 day thing. It's almost like it's a liquid, and it's based on traditional Chinese medicine, and it's got 3 traditional Chinese herbs in there that have really been shown to be antiviral and can, if you're starting to feel sick, you just kind of load yourself up with that for a couple of days, and that will have a great opportunity to knock out whatever's bothering you, whether it's a cold, whether it's the flu, or whether it's this coronavirus.
Well, doctor, unfortunately, we're out of time again. These times go very quickly. We've been speaking to Dr. Michael Lewis, who's an expert in viruses and treatment of viruses. Dr. Mike, how can people follow you?
Best place to go if you want to learn more about CV Defense and CV Acute, as well as how to support your immune system, go onto YouTube and look up CV Charlie Victor, CV Sciences on the YouTube channel, and lots of great information in a very entertaining format in some cases, but a lot of great information about how to support your immune system.
Dr. Mike, thank you for joining us today in an important conversation.
My pleasure.
If you missed any of this interview, you got to go back and listen to it, and you can do that by going to w420radionetwork.com to the archive section, and you can listen to this interview and previous interviews by Dr. Mike on what to do about treating yourself and your immune system to fight COVID-19. Introducing CV Defense for daily immune support with PEA. PEA backed by 6 double-blind clinical trials. Reishi mushroom extract. A proprietary blend of immune-supporting ingredients. Non-GMO, gluten-free, vegan, exclusively from CV Sciences. Go to empoweryourself.info.
W420radionetwork.com.